Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the College of Continuing and Professional Studies webinar, Mindsets and the Power of Perspectives. Thank you so much for joining us today. Next slide, please. It's a pleasure to have you all here this afternoon. My name is Lisa Beckham, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. If you have future questions about this webinar or other programs we offer, my contact information will be on the last slide of this presentation. Next slide, please. There are some logistical items I'd like to discuss and address before we begin. I ask that you please submit your questions throughout the webinar so we can address them during the Q&A portion of this presentation. To submit your questions, please go to the description on the bottom of the YouTube video and click on the link to the question form. Live captioning is also available as a link in the YouTube description box. To view live captioning, click the stream text link in the YouTube description box. Next slide, please. We will also send an email within a week with a link to the recording of this webinar. The link will be sent to the email address you submitted during registration. I'm also delighted to introduce the topic for today's webinar, Mindsets and the Power of Perspectives. Mindsets are assumptions and expectations about ourselves and others that guide our decisions, practices, and interactions. The view that you adopt of yourself and others strongly affects the way you conduct yourself in professional settings and how you interact with or lead your teams. For example, a mindset that favors dedication, grit, and hard work matters just as much as a mindset that favors innate brains and talent. It's an absolute honor to introduce the presenter for today's webinar, Carolien Moors. Carolien has applied psychology and business insight to challenges faced by leaders and teams as an organizational consultant, speaker, and coach, focusing on candor, accountability, and change for more than 30 years. Again, it's such an honor to have you here, Carolien, and thank you so much for being with us and agreeing to share your wisdom on this topic.
Oh, thank you so much, Lisa. You are very kind, and I really want to thank Lisa, Greg, Marie, and the whole team for making this webinar happen. So welcome to all of you, dear learners. I am very thrilled to quickly go over the objectives for today so that you make sure that you're in the right webinar. So we will look at the impact of the labels that you and I put on ourselves and other people's words, actions, on the interactions, the dynamics. The second objective, the relationship between your mindset, which is already clear, is something that you can influence with resilience, stress management, success, accomplishment, satisfaction, health. So that was the second one. The third objective, strategies, which might be especially of interest, of course, to accomplish those shifts in thinking whenever you have analyzed, found out that your line of thinking and your mindset aren't conducive to achieving results and accomplishments, but also to achieving healthy, fun, good relationships. So we will draw mostly from the following 4 experts and their books. Andrea Bonnoir with the book Detox Your Thoughts. And this is a book that she wrote very recently in 2020, and I'm very appreciative of it. You will see that in part 3 mostly. She's a sought-after speaker and a Georgetown psychologist. Number 2, Carol Dweck. And you may have heard of her mindset book that she wrote in 2006. She is a Stanford psychologist, and I will address her mostly in the introduction, in which we set the stage before we go to part 1, 2, and 3. Then Albert Ellis, a brilliant book, which is relatively old, 1996, How to Keep People from Pushing Your Buttons. And he is he passed, unfortunately, was a Columbia psychologist and the originator of the rational emotive behavior therapy. And I am very honored that I was trained in that therapy and especially how to apply it to people in organizations. And then fourth, Martin Seligman with the book Flourish. He wrote many other books, but this one he wrote in 2011. He is a Princeton psychologist and known as the father of positive psychology. So basically, dear learners, what we're going to be doing is drawing from cognitive psychology, cognitive neuroscience, as well as Gestalt psychology, which is a founder of emotional intelligence, as well as positive psychology. And just to make it clear at the onset, positive psychology is not about positive thinking quickies, right? And it's not about shallow practices because they don't last. They're not sustainable. They're not convincing. They're not durable. So, a couple of things before we dive into part one. The context for this webinar, obviously, you are eager learners. Otherwise, you wouldn't be signed up. So, I thank you for that and I applaud you for that. And there is personal and professional development reasons, I am sure, that the majority of you signed up for. Plus, maybe this even is more relevant than before. We are living very unprecedented times that require unusual and unprecedented resilience, optimism, all kinds of adjustments, learning agility, grit, perseverance, the best ways to manage our stress and uncertainties. So there are, of course, all kinds of things that occupy our mind, big things, big developments. And there are also positive elements to it, like hope, initiatives, unexpected opportunities that you may have had, new connections. So I would like to thank you for making time for this webinar and for wanting to expand your mindset and fine tune your mindset. So this word may have been used already like maybe 10 times, right? So what is that thing called mindset? There are wonderful, beautiful, many definitions, and I'm not going to bore you with those. I chose the 4 elements that I think are most relevant. If you like to use a different mindset or a different definition, that is totally fine. But when I think of mindset and look at all the experts that I was schooled in with a couple of degrees in psychology, then they refer to an established, which is important, set of beliefs and assumptions, or call it notions, that also turn into attitudes and thinking patterns that you and I hold about ourselves, about what a boss should be like, maybe about what a partner should be like, maybe how children in general should behave, or maybe about the differences between boys and girls or between managers and supervisors. So it's all those beliefs and assumptions that we hold, and many of them you will be aware of, I am sure. But I can guarantee you, after having been trained a lot in cognitive psychology, as well as having worked for 30 years with individuals and teams, that there are also assumptions and beliefs that we are relatively unaware of and sometimes completely unaware of, yet they do influence and they influence our mindset and they are a part of our mindset. So it's important to get to know those. And in that context, I would like to quote the great Aristotle, who said, knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. And I can tell you, whether I have a couple of degrees in psychology and a lot of experience, whether you are an established leader of 30 or 40 years or an established professional contributor, we do not know ourselves fully, completely in every single situation, right? But it is the beginning of all wisdom. So, a second element is assumptions and attitudes about yourself, others, situations, the world that we have built based on how we were raised, based on our values, based on our experiences. And of course, the past you and I cannot change, right? And if you have figured out how to do that, please contact me through LinkedIn afterwards, and I'd be happy to learn how to do that. But we can for sure fine tune, adjust, and add to our assumptions and attitudes. So we do not have to be a prisoner of our previous experiences, of our upbringing, even if that was a wonderful upbringing. Mindset is everything, is what I always remind myself or my clients of, because it determines your focus. It determines how you interpret situations, but also what labels you put on people, their actions, their behaviors. And therefore, it obviously also determines your responses. So you see the chain here, right? So the term mindset, if any of you are interested, was first used in the 1930s. This is quite a bit longer ago than a lot of people realize. And it was about habits of mind formed by previous experience. And again, you and I do not have to be a prisoner of that. So the foundation of this power of your mindset and the power of switching perspectives or even adding perspectives. Let's look at these 5 pieces of foundation, and please make sure that you take mental notes or physical notes with things that are new or interesting or thought-provoking for you, or those that you may not agree with, which is awesome, because then we can have a conversation and we can teach each other something or just expand our minds. So the first one is what you think is a choice, and it is your choice. This may seem so logical, right? But what you think is really a choice. So, what you choose to focus on when in a contested conversation with a colleague or in a kind of hard interaction with a family member, what you focus on and what you think is a choice. So you can ask yourself, this thought of, there he goes again, is not exactly a helpful thought, because it's going to make me focus on the wrong thing. I'm now just only going to see those things that he does wrong or that I perceive to be negative or unconducive. So, what other thought could I have? You could exchange that thought with, maybe I can ask a good question to understand his current behavior better or his current response. So, what you think is a choice, and it is your choice. We can never blame anyone else. Isn't that too bad? How you respond to situations is also a choice, of course. And that is probably something that you more consciously realize and maybe even tell siblings, your children, your colleagues. And it is based on assumptions and thoughts. Number 3, you have a right to all of your feelings, of course. No surprise there, I hope. Yet, having a feeling is different from acting on it. And I'm not saying never act on any feelings, of course. Absolutely not. Yet, whatever the feeling is and however you act on it, that will be your choice. And you want that to be a good and healthy choice for yourself, and possibly also for, if it is a dynamic with another person or on a team, also for the greater good and for the team. So, number 4, awareness of your assumptions, beliefs, and thoughts creates that choice. So, this is where, when I said Gestalt psychology as the founder of emotional intelligence, this is where that part of, or that school of psychology, walks into this webinar, so to speak, because awareness is crucially important to get to that Aristotle's wisdom of knowing yourself and realizing what you're sensing, what is pressing a hot button, maybe what is influencing you. And so when it is within your awareness, what you're thinking and how you're interpreting someone or something, or maybe even your own self-talk, right? And when you realize what labels you put on it, maybe you're having negative talks about the presentation that you're going to give to top leadership in your organization next week. If you're labeling it as a really important or interpreting it as a really important presentation, in which you really like to perform well, be clear and concise, and all that other good stuff, if you then label it too much pressure for me to deal with, this is horrible, then that labeling is not conducive to you performing, preparing, and get into the right mindset. So the interpretation may have been correct, that it is a really important presentation for you, but the labeling is self-destructive, if I may exaggerate just a little bit. So it gives you a choice, that awareness, to stick with the interpretation and or with the label, or to adjust it. And then adjusting your beliefs and thoughts requires you to focus really well on your thoughts, on the patterns that you see in your own thoughts, but also on the patterns that you see in dynamics with other people. It also requires continuous effort. So any one of you who signed up and thought that you're going to walk away with a positive mindset and what I refer to as positive thinking quickies, etc., that's unfortunately not how it works. I wished it was, because then a lot of people would be much better off, but it requires continuous effort and, of course, determination. So, with that, I would like to quote one of my very favorite authors and psychiatrists and philosophers, Viktor Frankl. You see the book mentioned here. I can highly recommend it. It could be your summer reading. It's very thin. I think it's impactful, but of course, we are all uniquely different. So I cannot guarantee you would find it impactful. But one of the many wonderful quotes that always gives me the chills is the next one. Everything can be taken from a man, from you and I, but one thing. He calls it the last of human freedoms. While he was locked up in a brutally dehumanizing concentration camp, and he said that one thing is to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances and to choose one's own way. Now, I regularly might find myself feeling disgruntled about something a little bit or complaining about someone or something internally in my head. And I attempt to always remind myself of this quote and a couple of other ones, because we always have the choice of our attitude, which of course is directly related to our focus and how you choose to look at a situation and label it. So let's get to Carol Dweck. She said, your mindset determines whether you believe that things like intelligence and talent are fixed, or that they are changeable traits, influenceable elements of what makes you you, that you can influence. That's a big difference. So you may have heard of the fixed mindset versus the growth mindset. So she says we have two different ones, but generally you and I will have a mix of both, but one will be stronger than the other. So people with a fixed mindset, if you recognize yourself and believing that your abilities are inborn, fixed and unchangeable, then likely in certain situations you will have a growth mindset, of course, because hardly anything is ever black and white. Some things are, but this definitely isn't. And then the second one, you may recognize yourself more in the growth mindset description, believing that your abilities can be developed, can be added to, can be strengthened by commitment, hard work, persevering, and by learning, continuous learning. So the two basic mindsets that shape your lives are the fixed and the growth mindset. And you see that with fixed, intelligence is static. With the growth mindset, intelligence can be developed. Now, you may think, I took this intelligence test 2 or 3 times maybe, and the outcome was pretty much the same. Well, we think there is more than just the traditional intelligence. And of course, you've already heard me speak about emotional intelligence. That is definitely something that can be developed. But even scoring on a traditional intelligence test can improve with a lot of learning and hard work. And maybe not for everyone, but it's important, I think, to remember that Dweck said Having a growth mindset doesn't involve believing that you can become anything you want to, if only you put enough education and effort into it. So highly likely you and I will never be able to become an Einstein or a Mozart. And if I just offended any of you listening in because you're a brilliant mind and inventor and musician, then of course you will be that exception. But I can tell you, when I think of myself, I will never be an Einstein or a Mozart just because I try really hard. So instead, the growth mindset is about living up to your possible potential, which is never really knowable, right? Not completely. So in the fixed mindset, challenges have to be avoided. In the growth mindset, challenges are embraced. Doesn't mean that you love them every single time, but you don't actively avoid them. So if you're thinking, how can I get more from that fixed to the growth mindset? This is one of your actionable items. If you recognize yourself more in the fixed group, to find ways to be around and be handed challenges, maybe not too big ones or too many at once, but embracing them more. Mentors, senior people in your field, someone that you know, maybe a sports coach, someone at church, someone in your family member, could even be your sponsor and the person who believes in you, right? So fixed obstacles give up quickly. Growth people, growth mindset, they persist much longer in the face of obstacles. That's where that word grit that Lisa already mentioned comes in, and where perseverance and not giving up and learning from whatever didn't work and moving on just a little bit wiser, a little bit smarter, with maybe a little different approach. I think of a 3-year-old with the absolute amazing ability to find maybe 20, 30, 40 ways to get that next piece of chocolate or that other bag of chips, even though mom and dad have already said no, I don't know how many times, right? They persist in the face of obstacles. They have not learned how to give up yet. And isn't that interesting? And of course, the stakes and the context are different than what you may be thinking of right now, whether it is your personal or your professional context. But sometimes I think it's helpful to just visually activate your inner 3-year-old. You, I'm sure, know what you looked like when you were 3 from old pictures, and whether it be 2, 3, or 4, doesn't matter. But activate that image and just find different ways of looking at a situation or of tackling a situation. Effort, generally fruitless or worse in the fixed mindset, the path to growth and mastery in the growth mindset. And setbacks are a sentence and a label in the fixed group, but they are informative input and motivating and provide insight and wisdom for people in the growth mindset. Feedback can be seen and is generally seen as criticism and ignored in the fixed, seen as an opportunity to learn in the growth. Now, I have to say with this one, many of us are not so thrilled with feedback. Even though Ken Blanchard, one of the leadership experts, said feedback is the breakfast of champions, and it sounds wonderful, and it is true, but receiving feedback is hard, dear people. So if you recognize yourself in someone who sees it easily as criticism and who easily personalizes feedback, don't draw the immediate conclusion that you have a fixed mindset, of course, right? Because there is more to feedback. And then success of others is seen as threatening to people with the fixed mindset, and people with a growth mindset may be a little upset that someone else was successful in the area that you just failed in, even if it is that black and white, but they still find lessons, inspiration in the success of others. And they don't just want to learn from their own experience, but also from family members, friends, colleagues. And so fixed mindset, you plateau early. It is a deterministic view of the world. Growth mindsets reach ever higher achievement and have a greater sense of free will. And wouldn't that be awesome? So part 1, the impact of the labels you put on your own and other people's words and actions. So this is where Albert Ellis comes in with his cognitive psychology. And he said, what you think in any kind of situation So your thoughts will determine how you feel and how you act. So there are different schools in psychology. Some say feelings come first and then the thoughts and the actions or responses. Others say the thoughts and the assumptions come first and then the feelings. I don't even care so much which one of the two you believe most, because the most important part is that they are intricately intertwined. They form a beautiful and sometimes really messy dance with each other that leads to responses and therefore results, desirable results and not so desirable ones. So Albert Ellis said that the excessiveness of our judgments and our labels is what gets us in trouble most, and it is consequential. So remember this, the excessiveness, but also the accuracy of your judgments and your labels. So how you label your own behavior. Ugh, that was a terrible moment during my presentation in that team meeting. That impacts how you feel about that meeting and about what comes next. Because generally, if you're still in that meeting, you will feel increased anxiety, maybe less focus because you are focusing on your negative self talk. Maybe you'll start fidgeting or stuttering or talking faster or losing eye contact. And then it all spirals downwards, right? So, how you label someone else's behavior is also crucially important, right? Because we interact with people on a daily basis, whether it is professional, personal, whether it is in person or virtual. So, for example, if you were to have the thought, it's outrageous, she has no right to talk to me like that. So, it's the outrageous part that Albert Ellis tells us it might be excessive and it might be not so accurate. And even if 100 people would agree it's not excessive and it is accurate, you want to ask yourself, is it helpful to use that label? Or is it helpful to say, I really do not want her to talk to me like that? So, what can I do to discuss that? What can I do to have a better rule of engagement with her? What can I do to assert myself? So you go to the solution and to what is possible. So you don't want to be left feeling victimized, angry, self righteous, combative. And people, please realize that it all happens to us to sometimes more than we like to. And that's where all these ideas and tips and strategies come into play, but also do realize we're human. We are human, and at times we will feel a little angry, combative, maybe even the victim. Just make sure that you know how to put a stop to it. So, your beliefs and thoughts. Step one, says Albert Ellis in that book, How to Keep People from Pushing Your Buttons. And he has a really good website, his RET Institute. So, you can find templates and examples. But step one is, what are your beliefs and thoughts about yourself or the person's behavior, or this situation? So, you want to write down the three most important, the strongest ideas that you have. So, when it is about maybe yourself right before you start the interview for a different job, that could also apply, right? What are your three strongest beliefs and thoughts about yourself? And are they helpful? Are they going to prepare me well? Are they going to give me confidence? Are they going to lead to behaviors by you in that interview that are going to help you? So, step two is, when you look at these three beliefs that you identified, are they realistic and fact based? So, where's the proof of my thoughts? So, let's just stick with the example of you preparing for an interview. If your belief about yourself is that you are really bad at responding to unexpected questions in the moment, when you say to yourself, I really suck at that. I always fail when I get unexpected questions that I didn't prepare for. Now, is that fact based? Always usually is not a word that is fact based. The words always and never, hardly ever apply. And I said hardly ever because sometimes they do. Is it rational or irrational? Are you awfulizing something that happened? Maybe it has happened before. And so you can find ways and ask others how they deal with those kind of situations. And sometimes it may just be to slow down, to pause, and to say something to the effect of, oh, let me consider that question for a moment. That gives you some time to calm down your thoughts, maybe calm down the breathing that immediately went up because of the anxiety. And it gives you just a little bit of calm and moment to reflect on what you would like to respond. So be on the hunt for shoulds and oughts. I should not. She ought to. He should never. Those kind of thoughts are generally exaggerated thoughts, exaggerated judgments, and labels that do not help you or I. And step 3, am I labeling behavior and events positive or negative, as okay, not okay? And am I doing that strongly? And also, am I taking responsibility for my part, or only or mostly blaming the person? So, with this model, this framework, you can improve your thought effectiveness by looking at an activating event. So, describe what had happened in that interview, in the meeting, with your child, with your spouse. Then look at the beliefs, the assumptions, the thoughts. And that, of course, requires self reflection, but honest self reflection, right? So it should, or it shouldn't. See here, the word should. It is best if you start that with questions such as, what may I have gotten wrong in my thoughts or assumptions about the person? What may I have exaggerated, right? So you look at the number C, it's the ABCDE model, the letter C, emotional consequences. So if whatever situation you're analyzing and the feelings and your responses and the outcomes were good or more than good enough, then this exercise isn't really necessary. But usually when there is a tense interaction or a situation of self-doubt, lack of confidence, or overconfidence and arrogance, which can get us in trouble as much as the other extreme, you want to find out what were the undesired feelings. And these are just 3 examples. They could be many more. Now, one of the most important things, in addition to the beliefs, is the number D, disputing those beliefs, assumptions, and thoughts. So again, questions like, where is the proof? How do I know? Does it help or does it harm? And do I have proof of the opposite that I didn't really consider in the moment or as I'm reflecting? So I want to give you an example. We'll do 2 examples. One is a professional, one is a personal. So the activating event could be, you don't have to report ready for your boss. You missed the deadline that he deemed really crucial. Maybe if I were to ask now, can you please show your hands? If this has ever happened to you, probably quite a few people would put up their hands, right? Number 2, the beliefs. What were those irrational beliefs, exaggerated beliefs, assumptions, and thoughts? One could be, this is terrible. There goes my chance to lead that big project. Or can you imagine yourself thinking something to the effect of, I hate the way he will address this. It'll make me look so bad. That's focusing on the other person, right? Or maybe you recognize yourself more in the next one. It's plain stupid I would be blamed. My team has been driving me nuts with their problems. So that is outright not taking responsibility and blaming others. So if we then go to Albert Ellis's step number 3, the consequences. So they would be excessive feelings of whether it's defensiveness or anger or stress, anxiety, not helpful. So then you go to disputing the factless or fact-free or low on fact and irrational or exaggerated assumptions and beliefs. So you'll see here 5 ways to do that, 5 questions. I generally like asking myself all of these and even more. I also use this with clients that I coach. So it's questions around the proof. How do I know for sure? What if I am wrong? A little bit about what I thought about him or her. What if I am completely wrong? in my thoughts that I had in the moment, is it really that terrible or that shameful or that whatever you want to fill the blank with? Or is it something that I will and can survive and something to learn from, something that I definitely want to change in the dynamic, but it's not the end of the world? So, does my team deserve my wrath, or do I want them to be mindful and solve problems themselves? So, you see, these are just a couple of the questions that you can use. So, example from your personal life. I think that all of us recognize this one. If you've never had a fight with a partner, then you should contact me for sure. And I would like to interview you for probably days, because that would make you an extremely exceptional human being. Now, some of us may fight more than others, but I think we all recognize that getting into a fight with someone we love, it happens from time to time. It makes us human. So maybe the belief is it's ridiculous that she doesn't get it. And you want to dispute that with the accurateness of the word ridiculous. Maybe a thought or a belief is things between us will never change. Maybe you've been together for a long time. So the general things and the never, those you want to dispute. And you want to ask yourself, what have we really done lately that might help us change that dynamic? Another one could be it's always the same with him or her. And then you could dispute the always and the sole focus on the other person. Maybe it's also always the same with me when I'm with him or with her. And another one, I'm totally fed up with this. Well, that's never helpful, right? The totally and the fed up. I'm not saying that we can salvage and restore every relationship and remain together with the greatest satisfaction all of our lives. Sometimes we really do want to break up, of course, right? And we want to change our relationship by choosing a different partner. That's of course not what I mean here, and what Albert Ellis means. He really wants you to ask yourself, are you really totally fed up? And if so, what have you done? And what can you do now? But we often exaggerate, remember those labels. So, healthier beliefs and thoughts. Some examples: I really do not like this dynamic, yet it's not the only dynamic that we have, and it will pass. So, that is an example of a healthier belief and thought in that personal example that we just had. Another one, it may not be easy to change our dynamic, yet I am sure I can think of one or two things that I can do differently to change it, however small the change will be. So remember Viktor Frankl, you choose your own response. And remember the importance of responsibility with Albert Ellis. Another one, I want my partner to be more understanding and supportive. I mean, who doesn't want that? Yet, if I don't get what I want, I can talk about it without the blowing up part. And that's crucial, of course. And I really like them to respond and relate differently, him or her or they, if it's more people, like on a team. Yet I can also admit to and really own my part in the dynamic, because we always play a role, right? So get ready for part two, the relationship between the mindset, resilience, stress, and success, mental health, balance. Mindset, as comprised by your beliefs and thoughts, they impact your interpretation of a situation or of your own self-talk, either way, and they impact how you label behavior, people, and events. Now, that labeling, as we've seen in the examples, can create stress or learning, depending on whether the labeling was helpful, was constructive, was at least a little bit fact-based, rather than completely exaggerated, one-sided doom thinking, like the Eeyore cloud hanging over your thoughts about the dynamic. And then, of course, all of this leads to either asserting control over your beliefs and thoughts, or not, and being a victim of your exaggerated labels, of your sole focus on the negative. And so that has an influence on your resilience, of course, on how you manage stress, on how you solve a internal or interpersonal challenge or dynamic. So I think you see here in this visual exactly what we talked about so far, that intricate relationship. So let's move to Martin Seligman. If you may remember, the founder, the father of positive psychology. And again, not about positive thinking quickies. It is not about just exaggerate the positive, just think happy thoughts, honey, and you'll be fine. That is not what positive psychology is about. It is about focusing on what is possible. It's about focusing on what can be done. It's about focusing on opportunities and possibilities. It's about focusing on what is within your reach, even though you may have to work a little harder at it. So, if you apply positive psychology in this way, it will help and build your resilience, of course, because it helps with the ability to cope with what is thrown your way, which is not to say that if you had to cope with um, worries about loved ones or colleagues, physical and or mental health in the last year and a half, worry about your own financial security, worry about a forced or not forced move in your career or a physical move, that that isn't to say that they are easy if you apply Albert Ellis, the growth mindset, and positive psychology, but it will be easier. So none of this is going to help you from ever being challenged, ever feeling stressed, but it will help you catch it earlier, and there where you have an influence through your mindset to become more resilient and bounce back quicker than if you were not to adopt a positive mindset. And of course, stress management is about finding effective ways to prevent it. But as we just discussed, we cannot always prevent stress from entering our heads, hearts, and houses. So we have to handle it. And we do that easier when we focus on positive psychology, on the quality of our thinking, when we do some thinking hygiene work, and when we apply that growth mindset. So I think that we should go to the what and how of self regulation. So you want to create more moderate feelings, not with the happy ones, not with the excited ones, but those that can lead to stress by influencing your beliefs, thoughts, judgments, your assumptions. And you want to replace the untested ones with the more tested ones, or the unrealistic ones with the more realistic ones, the exaggerated thoughts and judgments with less exaggerated and more rational ones, right? Then with problem solving, it's so much easier when you focus on what is possible, what is going well on the project, with the boss, with the loved one, but also on where you do have influence. I don't know whether you recognize this, but we sometimes focus our attention and allow our frustration to run wild by focusing on things that we cannot influence. And I would love to see a show of hand who is still trying to change their loved one. And if you are answering honestly, probably quite a few of you, us, me, myself, would still have our hands up. But the influence that is easiest to assert, and that isn't even easy, right, is on our own healthy thinking, our own healthy labeling, on trying to activate that growth mindset, as well as focusing on what is possible. So that also involves looking at different perspectives, literally putting on different glasses and asking ourselves, if my colleague Peter would be looking at this dynamic or would have been in this conversation with Susan, would Peter have thought the same things, labeled it similarly, and responded in the same way? And it's always best if we think of how would Sarah or Jim or Alexandra, how would those people that are very different from you have a different approach, different outlook on life, just a different way of interacting and problem solving? It helps if we activate the possible perspectives of people who I like to call contrarians, or at least different enough from you that they actually add a perspective. Because you may recognize the following: we usually hunt for corroboration of our narrative, right? So we'd rather go often to people who think and act like you and I, because when you do that, dear people, you feel better about yourself because they will likely say things like, "Oh no, totally, I know totally what you experienced. I would have thought and done the same thing. No, no, that's not on you. That's him or her." Well, it's might feel good to hear that approval of someone and to be reassured and to be told that you got it right, but it's not about you being right. It's about getting it right for a next time, getting it a little bit righter in the dynamic. So please seek people who think and act pretty differently. And then, of course, adaptability. Changing your thoughts, changing your approach for next time starts with constructive self talk. So maybe you thought for a couple of times already, gosh, this I'm good at, but that absolutely not. And, oh, maybe you thought this is hopeful or it's not so hopeful because I recognize too much of the more negative focus or the exaggerated labels or the fixed mindset. It's about becoming aware and reflecting, but also believing that you can do different a next time, do better a next time. So your constructive self-talk, it is what it is, or it went as it did. How can I influence, relate, think, label, respond differently next time? While of course you want to honor yourself and your values. So if you have thought, maybe how does assertiveness tie into this? Of course, you want to stand up for your values. Of course, you and I do not want to condone, accept any kind of mistreatment, whether it is bullying or harassment of any kind or discrimination of any kind. So that is the piece of honoring yourself and your values. Yet also, how can you respond differently in those cases where there is no harassment, bullying, etc.? So, because that is a very different topic, right? So, tips for controlling your thinking. It's kind of a summary. Taking that step back, getting into the helicopter, looking at your thoughts. So, distance a little from your thoughts. Don't be all invested in proving your thoughts and your labels right, because it's not about being right, but getting it right. Look for patterns. We humans are pattern seekers, some more than others. So, look for your thought patterns in similar situations and ask yourself, do they make sense? Are they helpful? Then, the finding the proof for your hot thoughts, that hot button kind of behaviors that really push you. Identify those that help and that don't help you cope and adjust and solve. And then challenge the need for, maybe it is approval, maybe it is being right, certainty, etc. Challenge that need. All of these things, approval, certainty, being really good and accomplishing without any mistake all the time and being right, it's all beautiful. I wish it upon you. But do you really need it to be true all the time? And yeah, you and I know the answer, right? We don't. So I'll let you look at these extra questions to dispute irrational and unproductive thoughts. And the first one, isn't that interesting? What was really said and done? Because we immediately put a little bit of dressing on it and our own self-serving interpretation. And that's why we so often, when we talk with a partner or a team member, a colleague or a boss about something that didn't go well, if we even do that, it's like, no, I didn't say that. Yes, you did. No. And those exchanges aren't really helpful, of course, but you can do your internal work and try and look back at the situation, preferably as quickly after the incident or dynamic as possible. And then ask yourself, what was really said? What was really done? So don't drag anything into it that maybe you know about the person, and they sometimes act like that, but they didn't this time. So the Do I Have Enough Data to Freak Out is one by Brene Brown. If you haven't heard of her, you may want to look at her TED Talk. Awesome approach about vulnerability and shame and leadership and many other topics. But she says, do I have enough data to freak out? Yes or no? And even if the answer is yes, it's really data based, then is freaking out going to help me? Well, that's kind of a weird question because the answer is always no. Another one, what am I missing possibly? What am I misreading? What am I not seeing? What am I focusing on too much? What if I'm wrong? That question that I already suggested. So these are good questions to ask yourself. So some examples. Either I'm good at something or I'm not, could be your fixed mindset idea. And so the growth alternative would be if I'm not good at something, whether it be playing the piano or doing math or painting or driving a car, I can get better at it with practice. That's for sure. Not saying I'm going to be brilliant, but you can get better at it. Another example of a fixed mindset, there is no point in trying if I know I'm going to fail. Well, first of all, we never know that for sure. So the alternative would be failure is an opportunity to learn, to reassess, to do better next time. And what is failure even, right? Some things, when you think of a project or program delivery, or of a solution to a problem, or launching a successful with metrics new product in a new market, of course those things can be a success or a failure, but many things aren't that black and white. Another one is I can learn, or I can't learn this anymore, it's too late, I'm too old. Have you heard that one? Maybe you've heard it yourself. Say the growth mindset is I can learn whatever I want or need to, exactly when I need to learn it, if I am willing to put in the effort. I'll give you two more examples. I already know everything I need to know. Maybe you've seen people act like that or heard people even say that out loud. Maybe it makes you cringe, right? The growth mind alternative would be I enjoy learning and growing. Learning is a lifetime pursuit for me. It's never too late to learn. And then another one, I've always been told that I can't do that math, learn to speak Dutch, which is my first language. The alternative, no one can know my potential. I must discover it myself without outside opinion and influence. And maybe I come to the same conclusion, but only after giving it a good try. And so it depends on you, what you want to focus on, what you want to get better at. And that's where you put your energy, your effort, your learning. That's where you seek mentors. So you see here this little visual of the growth mindset that drives motivation, achievement, and success. So how much time and effort do you want to spend on something? And that really is always your choice, right? So part 3, strategies to shift your thinking and positively impact your life and work. And of course, we already addressed strategies, right? With the ABCDE model by Albert Ellis, with moving from that fixed to a growth mindset, as well as with applying positive psychology. But I also want to give you some suggestions from that book, Detox Your Thoughts by Andrea Bonior. So she talks about, I don't know whether she phrased it like this exactly, but disempowering, unhelpful, and even dysfunctional thoughts. I've had a client or two, I have to admit, who will tell me, that's not really pleasant to hear, Caroline, that I have dysfunctional thoughts. And of course it isn't, right? But it may be helpful to rock the boat a little and to use strong words to have you wake up and figure out which thought patterns and assumptions are really helpful and fact-based and constructive and which ones really are not. So acknowledging the inaccuracies in your thoughts and without that self-condemnation. So I think Andrea Bonior does a little bit better of a job than I remember Albert Ellis doing, of making sure that we do it without condemning ourselves, without feeling bad, without thinking that we're doing it all wrong, because that would absolutely not serve the purpose, correct? Number 2, she says, determine which of these thoughts are worth worrying about and which of them I don't even want to try and change because they're not worth worrying about. They don't get you in trouble that much, or there are too many, and I want to focus on the ones that really matter to me in my current personal and professional context. So she says, you choose which ones you want to worry about and change with that learning mindset. A third tip from Andrea is know that negative thoughts only stick if you believe they are worth engaging with. And I think that's really interesting. So, for those of you who ruminate and worry and have certain recurring worrying thoughts in your head, self talk, and narratives, maybe you can remind yourself very regularly, which of these negative thoughts do I really find worth engaging with? And which ones am I going to push outside of my head? And of course, that sounds easier than it is. But even asking the question, which ones of these negative thoughts are worth engaging with, will activate your brain to make a decision rather than if you don't reflect and you don't question whether something is worth to engage with. She also says if the thought persists, repeat the thought in a silly voice or with great exaggeration. Just play and fool around a little or give your thought a name. Hi, Mr. Worry. Good morning. I don't want to see you today. Those kind of more humor infused ways of engaging with certain thought patterns are helpful for some people. If it doesn't appeal to you, there are multiple things that we've shared here. So choose those tips and strategies that appeal to you. But of course, I wouldn't be Carolien Moors if I wouldn't invite you to also choose one or two that don't seem to be so in line with who you are, that maybe don't seem to be so true for you, and still try them just for a 2-week experiment. 2 weeks, all I'm asking people. And then you will find out whether they are helpful or not. If not, shed them and find others. Number 5, remember that merely having a thought does not automatically make it true. And gosh, how I have to still remind myself of that on a way too regular basis. Having a thought, dear people, doesn't make it automatically true. Isn't that something, right? I could hear you talk and think. So reframing some unhelpful thoughts and feelings. So thoughts that turn into feelings that you find undesirable. And just giving 3 examples, there could be so many examples, of course. But one of them is, I will never be able to handle this. And you can change that and see what it does for you. I have the tools to get through this, even if it is hard. Or I can find the tools, even if you don't have them yet. Number 2, this is an awful situation. Albert Ellis calls this awfulizing just unpleasant situations. Because he's not saying, oh, you're exaggerating, this is a good or a happy or a helpful or a healthy situation. No, he says awfulizing means that you're making it worse all by yourself, which isn't helping you. So you can say, I feel afraid or worried or a little anxious, and that's okay. I will still be okay. And here are 2 or 3 things that I can do to help calm me down when it happens or when I do walk into the room for that presentation, or even right now in the moment. I often ask myself, what is one thing I can do to improve the situation right now? And then I'll ask for the next thing, of course, silently, right? Number 3, what's wrong with me? Into, anxiety naturally feels unpleasant, and not just for me, also others. And I'll breathe through it. I will survive. So, in closing, people, more practical strategies, avoid the all or nothing words. And I've already mentioned some of them. Test your damaging beliefs. Now, there she goes again, right? Dysfunctional thoughts, damaging beliefs. But they are, and we know it, even if we don't always realize it in the moment. So some of them are candor is disrespectful, kindness makes you a doormat, and you can read the others. So there is, of course, a reason why we have these beliefs, but we want to look at them. We want to look at them with different glasses. And I'll just take the first one. Candor done well is, to me and to many of my clients, the ultimate show of respect. It's the way you deliver your candor. Is it helpful? Is it specific? Is it uh, worded in a respectful manner with the right timing and done with, in my case, professional concern and love for the person? Or is it to get back at someone? Well, that last piece would definitely be disrespectful. So, for activities to reinforce a learning and growth mindset, steer out of that comfort zone. I think I made that clear even without having used that term yet. I suggest that you schedule daily or weekly reflection and keep a 21-day journal with some thoughts and labels in those situations that you want to improve in most, and then see patterns, see how you dealt with it, look for good moments of success. Also, stay on course and be patient as you seek out those learning opportunities. Don't get discouraged too quickly. Activate that inner 3-year-old and cultivate that grit and learning. Seek the constructive feedback, use positive language, focus on what you can do. So, with that, I really hope that you have been provoked a little bit, have been confirmed a little bit, and mainly that you took away some tips and strategies. And with that, I'll hand it back to Lisa.
Thank you so much, Caroline. I don't know about everyone, again, and we don't want to use those terms, but I know I feel less stressed from just having listened to your presentation, and really excited to try those strategies that you mentioned. We'll now move on to the Q&A portion of the webinar. Mm-hmm. Our first question, it's a pretty quick one. What is the name of the website you mentioned earlier when you were discussing beliefs and thoughts? I believe it dealt with RET.
Yes, okay. So if you search online R.E.T. you will find several websites. It's the Rational Emotive Therapy Institute, I believe, but I could be wrong. But either RET, Rational Emotive Therapy, Rational Emotive Therapy Institute, or even just Albert Ellis, and you will find that website. Thanks for that question.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Our second question is about mindset. So someone asked, how is mindset different or isn't different from perspective?
Excellent question. Yeah. So I think they're very related, but I believe that your and my perspective are the result of our mindset. So the mindset is made up of those established thoughts, assumptions, and beliefs, and they determine what kind of perspective we take, whether it is a shared responsibility perspective for a relationship gone sour, whether it is a more constructive, positive, or a negative doom Eeyore type perspective. So the perspective is really connected to mindset, but I think it is the result of those established assumptions and beliefs that we can change, of course. If you use the terms interchangeably, I don't even think it matters that much, as long as you know how to challenge your thoughts and your judgments and your labels, and how you can look at things in a more constructive manner, and how you can activate, with the strategies that we discussed, that growth mindset. I think that's the most important thing, but it's an excellent question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And I have one more. This comes from a listener who said, based on my observations, friends in management are afraid to provide feedback, either positive or negative. Mm-hmm. How does one recognize that their mindset, based on their observations, is invalid without feedback?
Could you repeat the last piece? Is or isn't valid without feedback? If you could repeat that, please. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So how does one recognize that their mindset based on their observations is invalid without feedback?
Hmm. Yeah, well, that's hard, right? Because then it becomes a battle for the truth, for the perspective. I agree with the reader or the listener's statement that many times friends, family, colleagues shy away from providing us with feedback. And so, what I would like to turn it into is how can I make clearer and provide more safety for the person to provide their feedback. And feedback is hardly ever the truth, right? Feedback is someone's observations, but likely with their interpretations and judgments. Of course, if the person providing you with feedback is higher in influence and power, then we have to probably do something with it. But feedback is simply that it's someone's observations and interpretations, someone's opinion, and sometimes, of course, again, when it's your boss, someone's request for you to do something differently or to improve. But in many situations, I like to think of feedback, whether it is based on true observations and on facts or not, it is something that has built a narrative in that other person, whether I believe it is a fact based narrative or not. And what really impacts my relationship and your relationship with people, whether it's professional or personal, is the narrative that they already gave it and the interpretation. So I think getting to a true conversations about where you see the differences and where you see the connections could be helpful. But it's of course hard to look at narratives and feedback in black and white terms, whether it's true or false. And sometimes feedback is really true, right? If I am being, or if you have a certain deadline to make and you didn't make it, or you have a certain sales quota to make and you don't make it, then feedback around that is data based, right? But I'm sure the listener wasn't talking about that kind of feedback.
Right. Well, again, thank you so much, Caroline, for your time, your incredibly useful information. I know I've walked away with a lot to both work on, and again, I'm just feeling a little less stressed than before. So it's been
Oh,
an absolute pleasure having you here.
thank you. And I want to thank all the people who participated. You are awesome learners, and I applaud you for that. Thank you.
Yeah, and as I mentioned earlier, we will be sending a link to the webinar recording following today's webinar. Please, if you have a moment, take a moment to let us know what you thought about this webinar by clicking on the survey link in the description portion of the YouTube video. This survey is brief and your response will really help us shape future webinar experiences. If you enjoyed this webinar and would like to continue engaging in similar topics, please take a look at our upcoming professional development courses shown on this slide. My contact information is also listed on this slide if you'd like to learn more. Thank you again, everyone, so much for joining us today. Have a wonderful rest of your afternoon. Take care, stay safe, and be well.